Hi, Andrew Cuneo here with another video. It's day one of Innistrad Crimson Vow on Magic Arena. Unfortunately, the server's having some trouble, so you can't play any matches right now, but I thought I would take this opportunity to go over two approaches of blue-black control I'm planning to try in the new standard. The reason I want to try these is I think Hullbreaker Horror is going to be one of the best cards in the new set, and I think it's the perfect card for blue-black control. It can't be countered. It's got flash, so if you want to play at instant speed, you can make your deck do that. It's just, if you get to untap with this card and you've built your deck so you have a lot of instants, you really are going to have control of the game, because you'll be able to bounce your opponent's permanents. If they target the Hullbreaker Horror, you can play an instant and bounce the horror back to your hand, or if you want to keep it in play, you can bounce their spell off the stack back into their hand, forcing them to spend mana again, which they might not have. And especially if you're trying to beat Alrund's Epiphany, the ability to return a spell you don't control to its owner's hand with an instant is going to be huge, because their Epiphany is always going to cost 6 or maybe 7 mana. So you're effectively just making your entire deck full of divide by zeros in some sense by doing that. So this is one approach that I want to try. This deck is based very heavily off of Shaheen Soorani's top 8 deck from SCG Con at the end of the last standard season. So it's a Lier deck. It's got kind of the usual suspects for a Lier deck. It's got Duresses and Fading Hopes. And it has no just straight up counters in the deck. There's a couple Jwari Disruptions, and then there's Divide by Zero, which works with Lier. Even though Lier makes all of your opponent's spells uncounterable, you can still return them to the opponent's hand. Also has Go Blanks. So this is a deck that it's a control deck that doesn't really rely on permission. It relies on attacking your opponent's hand. And then eventually you can set up a situation where you're just going to be bouncing their spells back to their hand. I played a lot of blue-black control in the last standard. I didn't play this style of deck. I played a different style of deck. And one of the cards I really didn't like was Flunk. But this deck's a little bit different, because this deck has 4 Duresses and 4 Fading Hopes. You actually can get cards out of your hand, and cards out of your opponent's hand, I guess, more importantly. So the Flunk is going to, Duress enables Flunk. Same thing with Go Blank. I was playing a build of blue-black that didn't have those cards, and that meant that Flunk was not very reliable. One thing to note with this deck is it has a lot of lands in it. It has 24 normal lands, and then it's got 2 copies of the Celestus, 2 copies of Hagra Mauling, 2 copies of Jwari Disruption. So you're going to be making your land drops. One card it doesn't have is Consider, which maybe should be in the deck given the Hullbreaker Horror, because it's an instant that, it's going to be very nice to be able to cast with the horror. I'm going to try this build without Consider to start. I've got a second video, or a second build I'm going to show you guys that will have Consider in it. I also like the split of Behold the Multiverse and Memory Deluge. This is something I was doing in my own blue-black decks, although I was doing a 3-1 split. But I really think that you want to have a mix of these in a blue-black deck, just because you're not necessarily going to have a good way to use your mana on turn 2. And so sinking it into a Behold when you've got a mix of Behold and Memory Deluge in your hand is a pretty big deal. Looking at the sideboard, we've got, I think, a pretty standard complement of lessons, just environmental sciences, teachings of the Archaics, and Mascot Exhibition. There aren't really any additional ones that help you beyond that. One new card that I'm excited to try out is Parasitic Grasp, which I think is going to be quite strong against White Weenie. Their deck's mostly filled with humans, and the ability to, kill a creature, gain 3 life, and then potentially cast it again with Lier is a really big life swing. So I've made room for some of those. I think I cut one of the Hermits from Shaheen's version of the sideboard. One thing I also did, Shaheen did not have Graveyard Trespasser in his deck. He had Nighthawk Scavenger, which I like this card a lot. I think it's good in a lot of places that's kind of surprising, where if you need to fight someone's graveyard, it lets you do that. If you're fighting against a creature deck, a creature deck like White Weenie, it's a big enough body that it matters. The ward ability means that they just can't interact with it profitably, and it also gains you life. So I like having a couple copies of that. It's a little bit awkward with Crippling Fear because you need it to be night, or I guess you can also just say werewolf. So it's not really that awkward with Crippling Fear. So that's a card I like that Shaheen didn't have, but I'm going to continue to try. So this is my update to Shaheen's style of blue-black, which is basically defined by being a Lier deck and a Divide by Zero deck. That's one version to try. Then we can look at my update to my own version, which was not that successful in the previous standard, but I think I think that Hullbreaker Horror and Syncopate are potentially cards that are really going to improve it substantially. So the difference here is there's no Liers in the deck at all, meaning that you can play counters. So there's negates, which I think is the best counter to be playing. Just in the matchups where you want to counter, it's the counter you want. There's also 3 copies of Syncopate, which just got added into Standard. It's a reprint, but it wasn't previously part of Standard. So Syncopate's really nice in that it's very good against cards like Goldspan Dragon and a lot of the 3 and 4 mana plays out of the green decks. That's where this card's really going to shine. In previous versions of Standard where this card or cards that were like it were available, I didn't really like going above 2 copies because once you fill your deck with a lot of permission, one way people try to fight you is they try to get a turn where they're going to cast multiple spells in a turn. And if your counters are just multiple Syncopates, it gets pretty awkward for you because your first copy of Syncopate might require you to just tap all of your mana to make it an effective card. So I haven't liked playing 3 in previous standards. I want to try playing 3 in this version of Standard because I do think that the curves are going to be a little bit on the higher side, especially in matchups where you're going to want counters. If you're playing against a deck like White Weenie with Thalia, there isn't really a counter you want in your deck. You're just going to sideboard them out regardless of what you've put in your main deck. Just all the counters are going to come out. A couple other differences with this build. I've got 4 copies of Siphon Insight, which is a card I really like a lot. I think it's really strong in blue mirrors, and it's a way to make your land drops. It's a way to, in sideboarded games, a lot of times if you play against a mid-range deck, they will have taken their creature removal out of their deck, and you're just going to be taking their threats and casting them, and they're not going to have good ways to interact with it. It's like a better version of Think Twice, which Think Twice, when it was in Standard the last time, which was a very long time ago, was a really strong card. Cards in general have gotten better now, so Siphon Insight, even though it's a little better than Think Twice, it's still not really a standout, but it is a pretty strong card. And it's nice to have instants that you can just cast without having to worry about, is there a target in play for me to be able to do something with the instant once you've got the Hullbreaker Horror in play. That's the same reason I've got 4 copies of Consider in my deck, because I want instants I can just cast that are cheap when I have Hullbreaker Horror out. Another interesting part about this deck is I've got Meathook Massacre as opposed to Crippling Fear or Shadow's Verdict. I think Meathook Massacre is the better sweeper, or the best sweeper, but it doesn't work with Lier. So if you're going to play with Lier, you probably want a sweeper you can recur from your graveyard. Can't do that with Meathook Massacre. You can recur Meathook Massacre by bouncing it with Hullbreaker Horror if the game's in the spot where that's something you need to do. Also, if you have Divide by Zero in your deck, you can bounce Meathook Massacre with that. In the past, I've played this deck as a Divide by Zero deck, but with the printing of Syncopate, I wanted to try more of a Syncopate style build. One thing to note here is that I only have 23 actual lands, plus 2 Jwari Disruptions, plus 1 Hagra Mauling, whereas the other build of blue-black had substantially more lands. But you have to remember, there's 4 Considers in this deck that are going to help you find lands. There's 4 Siphon Insights that are going to help you find lands early on in the game. So you are going to get to make your land drops. Another difference, I've got a power word kill as opposed to a flunk. The idea behind that being there's no Duresses in this deck, so my experience was flunk didn't turn on reliably enough. Power word kill is really good, except it doesn't kill Goldspan Dragon, it doesn't kill Faceless Haven. So that's pretty big drawbacks, but it is still a solid card. Another difference is there's no Fading Hopes. There's lots of Bloodchief's Thirst. There's lots of Infernal Grasps. Fading Hope in this style of deck where you don't have a haymaker that you're just stalling to get to like Lier is not nearly as good. Sure, you are stalling to get to Hullbreaker Horror, but you just don't have that many copies of it. So I think you want more just actual removal, fewer tempo plays. There might be too much one-for-one removal in this deck, but I think those cards are just generally pretty strong in Standard. Looking at the sideboard, I don't even have any copies of Duress, which may seem a little bit crazy, but my experience when playing this style of control deck was people always board in Malevolent Hermit against you, and boarding in Duresses doesn't really do anything to address that. So I've got Malevolent Hermits, I've got Graveyard Trespassers, which can get the backside of Malevolent Hermit. Then I also have Check for Traps, which I think might become a more important sideboard card if Hullbreaker Horror becomes what the blue mirrors revolve around, because you can just take the horror out of your opponent's hand with this. You can also take Malevolent Hermit out of their hand, which is a pretty big deal. And then a couple copies of Go Blank. I do think that's really good. 4 Crippling Fears. In the past, this deck did struggle a little bit with the cheap creature decks, and I think Crippling Fear is just super well situated right now. So this is a little bit more, I guess I would say this is a much more unproven build compared to the first build, but I do think it has some potential, and it remains to be seen what's the right way to build your control deck with Hullbreaker Horror. And honestly, this might not even be the right combination of colors. You might be able to build a blue-white version. I think this card is so strong, it just demands to find a home. And control decks are one of the homes for it. I think you could also maybe just put it in just like a ramp deck, where you're just planning to ramp out threats and then just bounce your opponent's permanents and attack them with, whatever your mid-range cards were. So I'm going to be looking at a lot of different builds for how to use Hullbreaker Horror. This is one of the starting points. The Lier deck is another one, and I'll be making some follow-up videos to show you what I decide is the best way to do it. But I think this card is really, I think this is going to prove to be the best card from Crimson Vow. And I think it's going to be a card that might really change the way the Standard metagame shapes up. It's possible that this is going to be the card that kind of trumps the Epiphany decks. And if the Epiphany decks get forced out of the meta, then maybe more mid-range decks can flourish. And this card, while it is incredibly powerful, it's a little bit different from Epiphany in that you can fight against it just with creature removal spells. Like Infernal Grasp is going to kill this. If I just spend 7 mana and tap out to cast this, and you have Infernal Grasp, that's a great trade for you. If I wait till I have 8 mana, it gets a little bit more dangerous because I might be able to bounce it back to my hand, but even then, I'm spending 8 mana and you're spending 2 mana on Infernal Grasp. And you're down a card, but you've profited a lot of mana. That's all a long way to say that this might be the new best late game card in Standard, but it is one that mid-range decks can fight against, which means that there might be a little bit more room for some more diversity in Standard. That's certainly what I'm hoping for. If you've got any other ideas for how to tune these decks, please let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.